Good to see each and every one of you here this evening. As Marshall mentioned, we're going to be continuing our theme from this morning. You might go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, and we'll be looking there in just a moment. Marshall dealt with the technical side of the question, the vocabulary of the question this morning, and dealing with the word study. And what we want to deal with this evening is sort of the pushback that often comes. And as we're looking at the objections to really the case that Marshall made this morning, I've tried to summarize what I hope are the most common objections that are offered under three categories. I'm sure that you might have heard or might hear objections that I won't cover this evening, but I think as an umbrella, we're covering most of that territory. But I want to say a couple of things before we get into that this evening, and that is about the importance, as Marshall talked about some this morning, the importance of a study like this. It can feel tedious, and it can feel maybe even unnecessary from the standpoint of maybe you think, look, I'm not getting a divorce. You know, this is not on my radar. This is not something I'm dealing with, and I already agree with where you're ending up, and so I don't think I need to be convinced of these things. And so why are we spending this kind of time? And of course, there is the aspect of the increasing likelihood that you will face this. I can remember when I was growing up and in my family and the people that I knew, my circles, just hearing about divorce and thinking, I mean, what does that have to do with me? Nobody that I know is divorced. And I hardly think anybody could say that now. Divorce is so prevalent. Well, right alongside that is pornography is so prevalent. And people, let me just say this, people have always looked for additional reasons for divorce. I was just reading this last week, a book about marriage and family in the Middle Ages. And so it's talking about marriage and divorce, and it talked about one of the ways or one of the reasons that people could get their marriages annulled by the Catholic Church was if they could prove that they were actually related. They just didn't know it when they got married. Turns out they're related, so now it's incest, and then the church would grant them an annulment. And so they would go to scribes and hire scribes to find connections and then bring those papers. Say, look, we're actually third cousins. We didn't realize it. That's actually what Henry VIII did in one of his divorces. And so the Catholic Church ended up having to go, wait. We can't just be granting annulments just because you found some long-lost connection that makes you related. And the point I'm making is even at a time when the religious world was fairly well agreed on the limitations of divorce, people were still trying to be very creative in figuring out ways to sort of justify breaking up marriages. I think that's a lot of what's happening here, and we'll talk more about that as we get along. But another thing that I want to say before we get into the lesson is this, that when we are talking about subject matters that maybe don't feel as pressing in your life, what we are doing, I believe, is exercising our senses. As the Hebrew writer talks about in Hebrews chapter 5, they exercise their senses to discern between good and evil. And if what we do is every time we say, well, I don't think that's immediately got to do with me, I don't want to think about that, I don't want to talk about that, then what you're doing is you're refusing that very thing until the moment where you need the senses already to be exercised. And that's no good. We want to be exercising all along. And so when an issue comes up, we do want to examine that. And we do want to examine our thought processes. And let me just say this. It carries over into other issues. If we have sloppy thinking on issues like this is not the only issue that will affect. And in fact, sloppy thinking on other issues has opened up vocabulary for this very issue that has made it easier for the people to make their case that are making the case that Marshall preached against this morning. I'll just give you one example in talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. You know, when we've talked about this before, when we talk about somebody gets a divorce for a reason other than adultery, then we say they didn't have a right to divorce. And some people would say, then in God's eyes, they never really divorced. Or in God's eyes, they're still married. Now, I understand a lot of times what people mean is God considers that not a justified divorce and so forth. But then what people have done is taken that very language and said they actually are still married until somebody comes up with an actual reason for divorce, and then you got mental divorce, right? So people who I don't think believe in mental divorce, because they've been, I think, imprecise in their language, have lent credibility to mental divorce. I think the same sorts of things can happen here, and we'll see that as we go along. So we want to be precise. We want to be precise in our thinking and in our language, not only so that we can come to correct conclusions about an issue, this specific issue, but even other issues that overlap as we're talking about marriage and so forth, and just how to think biblically. It's just how to think biblically about any issue that comes along. Well, let's look at the first objection, and I think this covers a lot of territory. A lot of people are afraid, or the argument is made that what we're doing is we're saying that after all, pornography is really not so bad after all. That pornography is not so great a sin. We're minimizing it. We are saying that, so you just don't have a problem with a husband. I've actually had this said to me. So you just don't have a problem with a husband sitting down and looking at pornography. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I absolutely have a problem with a husband, or frankly, anybody else, sitting down and looking at pornography. That is not the question at all. And let me just say, of course, they will bring up Matthew chapter 5, which we made reference to this morning, and we'll look at again here, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 31. This is where they'll go to show that, this is a primary text, I would say, that they'll go to show that sexual immorality is inclusive of pornography. He says, I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. Or excuse me, we should be backing up actually into verse 27. You've heard it was said you should not commit adultery, but I say to you, everyone that looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. But if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And so here's this equating of lust and adultery. Well, what is Jesus trying to do here? Is he trying to say that they are precisely the same thing? I think what he's trying to do is make a spiritual comparison. And what he is trying to do is to say to people who have minimized lust, pornography, have minimized hatred in the context, have minimized any number of sins that are in the same spiritual category as the ultimate outcome of those spiritual sins. He is trying to increase that awareness. He's trying to increase that conviction so that the person doesn't go around thinking that if I haven't committed adultery, anything and everything else that I can or might do up to that point is just all right. He says it's not the case. And so he's lifting that up and holding it up. And so I would say right off the bat to anybody who thinks, well, all I'm doing is looking, let me just lift that right up and say, don't at all take away a notion that you are not in danger of hellfire. Pornography will send your soul to hell, and it will ruin you all along the way till you get there. So no, I don't want to minimize that, not in the least. And additionally, let me be clear that, as I just said, the wages of sin is death. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 23. And so there is a certain sense in which, as we talk about sin, every sin will separate you from God. Every sin brings condemnation, and every sin makes us guilty of the blood of Jesus Christ, right? So we all find that we are guilty of sins, and at no point do we want to come into comparisons from the standpoint of my sin won't send me to hell. No, they'll all send you to hell. So we're not making that kind of comparison. But God has distinguished between sins in a number of different ways. In Ezekiel chapter 8, there's a series of visions here for Ezekiel. And beginning in verse 6, Ezekiel 8, beginning in verse 6, it says, he said to me, Son of man, are you seeing what they are doing, the great abominations which the house of Israel is doing here, so that I would be far from my sanctuary? But yet you shall see still greater abominations. And then he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. And he said, Son of man, now dig through the wall. So I dug through the wall, and behold, an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the evil abominations that they are doing here. So I entered and looked, and behold, every form of creeping things and beasts and detestable things with the idols of the house of Israel, with all the idols of the house of Israel, were carved on the wall all around. Standing in front of them were the 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jahaziah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them, each man with a censer in his hand and the fragrance of the cloud of incense rising. He said to me, Son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each man in the room of his carved images? For they say, Yahweh does not see us. Yahweh has forsaken the land. And he said to me, you will see still greater abominations which they are doing. And then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the house of Yahweh, which was toward the north. And behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. And he said to me, do you see this, Son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these. So you see that progression. And I wonder if at some point Ezekiel thought, what could get worse? But God said it can. Now, there's a sense, as we've already suggested, that all the sins bring separation between God and his people. All the sins will send you to hell. And yet, there's getting farther and farther and farther from God that is possible. Sins can be worse, and they can be worse in God's eyes. God is the one saying, this is bad, this is worse, this is even worse, and this is worse still. And so there can be a progression. There can be something that is already horrible. At no point, at the first vision that Ezekiel sees, we would never say, well, that's not so bad. In fact, the whole point is it's already bad enough. It's horrifying, the first thing he sees. And how could it be then that God could say worse things still? But worse things can be and will be. And so he did see more and more, greater and greater abominations, as he says here. Over in John chapter 19 and in verse 11, Jesus also uses this relative language, this comparison language. John chapter 19 and verse 11, Jesus answered, this is to Pilate, and says, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. So Pilate's not so bad, really. That's not the idea. And in fact, I think if anything, this is almost to suggest to Pilate, you're not even the biggest player here, right? You're not the one that's moving the pieces here in reality. But Pilate bears his sins. Pilate's washing of his hands did nothing to wash his tremendous sin, full of guilt and cowardice, all the things that he was involved. And yet Jesus is saying, you're not even the biggest problem here. And so, again, there are comparisons. So I think there's weight that we add to the sins, though there is an equality of weight here, there is a distinction of weight in another sense. And I think that could be from the standpoint of physical consequences. I think that could be from the standpoint of how far away from God you've gotten, how calloused you've gotten in your sins. There's all sorts of things that can, make that weight be different from one sin to the next. But in addition to God making those distinctions, we also see that God makes a distinction in the punishment for sin. And this is where we really, I think, get to an idea of God's calculus, if you will, when he looks at sin. When we read through the old law and we see where God says, this will be the punishment for this sin and this will be the punishment for this sin. This is how you know how bad a sin is perceived to be in any particular society, right? What are the punishments? What do we say about that? When we are just speaking off the cuff, hyperbole and so forth, we might say with regards to a sin, we say, that person deserves to be under the jail, right? We say it's not good enough just to put that person in jail. That person ought to be under the jail. And what we're saying is that is a much worse offense than this thing over here. Even prisoners among themselves have a certain degree, and I'm not saying it's biblically based, but they have a certain degree of hierarchy of sins, right? There are certain sins. When you go into a prison population, you will be viewed among criminals as the worst. And you'll be treated as such. Because that sin, that's way worse than what the rest of the people in here did. And especially sins that involve children, for instance, right? So again, you're seeing degrees. But that's present in Scripture. So over in Deuteronomy chapter 19, sometimes the difference in punishment is because the consequence of the sin is different. Right? It can be the exact same sin, but with different consequences. So in Deuteronomy 19 and verse 16, it says, if a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before Yahweh, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. And the judges shall inquire thoroughly, and behold, if the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he is intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you, and the rest will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such an evil thing among you. Thus your eye shall not show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So you bear false witness. What's the punishment for bearing false witness? Well, that depends. What was going to be the consequence of your false witness? Was the consequence of your false witness going to be that this man was going to lose his life? Then you'll lose your life. Was it going to be some relatively minor harm? Then you'll suffer relatively minor harm, but you will suffer that minor harm. And so you say, but it's all the same. You're lying. The sin is the same, yeah, but the consequences are not. And so God is addressing this particular sin with the consequences of that sin and said, measure for measure. That's how this is going to be meted out. Now, there's a spiritual sense in which it is all a lie, right? It all separates you from God, but there's a consequence sense in which God says the consequences are not the same. Well, Deuteronomy 22 then, in Deuteronomy 22, let's go back, if you'll hold your finger there. Go back to Exodus 21. I'd like to look at that first. Exodus 21, and there, beginning in verse 12, there it says, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. If, however, a man acts presumptuously towards his neighbor so as to kill him by deceit, you shall take him even from my altar that he may die. Here is a place where the consequences are the same. Right? Somebody's dead. But the motive matters. right? So in the case of the false witness, it's what would be the consequences of your sin. You're lying. Lying is the same, but the consequences are different. Here, the consequences, somebody's dead, that's all the same. But how did it happen? And why did it happen? Right? And we're going to make a distinction. And if somebody did this with intent, then he's going to suffer the death penalty. And if somebody did this without intent, then I'm going to make provisions for him to avoid that death penalty. Now, somebody whose loved one has died, let me ask you, does it make a difference to him? No, his loved one's still dead. And he might emotionally say, this is unfair. But it's not unfair. Right? Even though the impact is the same on the family and so forth, and the emotional impact, and they're still suffering all the same as to whether you killed them on purpose or by accident. That doesn't matter to the person who lost their loved one, but it matters to justice, and it matters to God. And God makes a distinction and says these are not the same thing, and we're not going to punish them as if they were the same thing. Well, then that brings us over to sexual sins, going back to Deuteronomy and chapter 22, Deuteronomy 22, beginning in verse 22, he says, if a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman, thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Now, incidentally, that is what God thinks of adultery. He thinks a lot more of it than we do. He thinks a lot more seriously of it than we do. That he put the death penalty, he made that a capital offense. And so that falls into that category. If there is a girl, he says, who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out of the gate of the city, and you shall stone them, and they will die. The girl, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he had violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. So we're making some distinctions here now. All right, so we started with what is understood and implied, that you have people who are not married to each other, who are married, one of them is married, and they lie with each other consensually, both of them are going to die. Then you have another consensual sexual interaction, you have adultery or fornication, but you have an engagement, and again, both participate, they're going to die. Then you have one agreeing to participate and one not. Well, then the one who agreed, the one who raped, is going to be guilty, but the woman who cried out, she's not going to be guilty, right? She's not going to suffer those consequences. But keep going. It says, but you shall do nothing to the girl. There's no sin in the girl worthy of death, for just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. Then, verse 28, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. A man shall not take his father's wife, so they will not uncover his father's skirt. So, as you're looking down through there, is God minimizing the sin of this last sexual interaction? Not in the least. He's dealing with it. He's dealing with it differently. It's not a capital offense. And I believe in particular what he's doing is protecting the girl in that circumstance and making sure that she is not left to suffer the consequences of that forced interaction, potentially forced interaction, all by herself. She's going to be taken care of. And in fact, she's going to be taken care of with the impetus that you can never stop taking care of her, right? You will take care of her for the rest of your life. You just owned that. Now, all of that sin, but not all of it's handled the same way. You say there's degrees and there's distinctions in sexual sin. It's all sexual sin. It's all fornication. It all fits the definition of what Marshall was talking about this morning. And yet each instance, God says, this is what we'll do here. This is what we'll do here. So to say that the consequences of sin are different is not to say that one sin doesn't matter as much as another. It is perhaps to say that one sin is worse than another. I do believe that. And I'll just go ahead and confess that and say, so you think that this is not as bad as adultery? I don't. Doesn't mean I don't think it's bad. Doesn't mean I don't think it's hurtful and harmful and all of those things. But it's not the same. And because it's not the same, then it doesn't have the same consequences. We have to make distinctions about what those consequences are. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the lesson. The second objection that I get, and I've had this one directed specifically in dealing with a marriage that was breaking up over this very thing. And the argument was made, he broke his vows. Well, he did. That's no question that it is a violation of the vows we make in marriage for a man to look at pornography. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for. You're certainly violating that. But to be more specific, we had fairly traditional vows in our wedding. And I took them back out and looked over them, and it violates to be true, to be loyal. It violates forsaking all others. There's so many elements in our vows that certainly this goes against and just tramples over. So I do not deny that a man has broken the vow that he made to his wife when he looks at pornography, or for that matter, a woman vows to her husband if she looks at pornography. But Christ did not say generically violating your marriage vows was cause for divorce. That's just not what he said. He said a specific violation. That is adultery. There are 100 different ways you can violate your vows every single day that do not fit the definition of Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9 that Marshall talked about this morning. And so, when somebody comes and says, look, isn't breaking the vows, isn't that essentially adultery? It's not. It's not. Now, you could make some comparisons between that and adultery, but it is not, in fact, adultery. And that's the thing that Jesus said was the cause for divorce. When a woman said to me this argument that her husband had violated the vows, I said, do you remember what your vows were on your wedding day? And she energetically said, absolutely. I said, have you ever failed in any of them? And she looked at me stone cold and said, not once. Wow. That's a perfect person, as James would say. I doubt that that was the case. In fact, I know it wasn't. I was in the presence of both of them on more than one occasion when I know she was violating those vows. I know that just like he had been told to love her as Christ had loved the church, she had been told, for instance, to be subject to her husband, which she was not. She had been told, for instance, to respect her husband in verse 33 of Ephesians chapter 5, which she absolutely had not. Now you could say, well, now look, he wasn't very kind to her. I know. But if his love is called upon no matter what she does, then her respect is called upon no matter what he does. We both are given our instructions no matter what the spouse does. And there's a degree of humility that's needed in any of these discussions when we start saying, the other person has mistreated me. Now let's just stop for a moment and back up and think, have I participated in this at all? And the fact of the matter is, often, yes, everybody's participating. But even if you have not participated in this specific thing, haven't you failed? And would you have your spouse rise up and cry out divorce every time there is a failure on your end of any sort? Can I just suggest that's the way the world approaches divorce? Is that every time somebody's not pulling their end, they're not doing their part, then they say, this isn't working. So what's the solution? Well, God takes this solution, divorce, off the table for all but one of those reasons. And I'll tell you what, if that's off the table, you get a lot more motivated to figure out what the problem is and to make changes so that the problem doesn't continue. But if that's always an out, then yeah. And that definition is going to be ever expanding, which of course it has been. I think one more thing to add here, and I think this is a touchy subject. Well, the whole thing is, but even when there is actual adultery, not virtual, but actual adultery, God's law is not, you must divorce. In fact, I think what God wants is a mindset that says, that wants to keep marriages together. And he shows that by his own behavior. In Hosea chapters 1 through 3, he shows his willingness to go again and again and again to the adulterous wife that is Israel. In Jeremiah chapter 3, you have much the same thing. He's written a certificate of divorce, but the whole chapter is saying, but it's not over. I'd take you back. Even now, I'd take you back. And so God shows that his desire is not for us to at a moment's notice, look for a way to get out of the marriage. And I think even with adultery, there are some people who look at it that way. I know I've been involved in these discussions when you've got a marriage, it's just a wreck. Neither one of them like each other. They're just at each other's throats all the time. And so one of them goes and hires a private investigator. I'm not against hiring private investigators. I understand there's time and place for all of these things. But sometimes people just go straight there. And they go straight there because they're hoping against all hope that they could find some reason to get out of this miserable marriage. And when they get out of that marriage, it won't be because of the adultery. That'll just be the thing that gives them the legal right, even though they've been wanting out for a long time before that came along. They're not the brokenhearted picture of someone who's faithful to their spouse, but has been brokenhearted so many times and there's nothing else they can do. They are the picture of somebody who is just fed up and wants out, and maybe they'll give me a reason. I think that's not the picture God paints for us. But when we do have that sense, then what happens is not only are people hoping, keeping their fingers crossed, women withholding themselves from their husbands withholding themselves from their wives, hoping that they can get them to do the thing that will let them out of the marriage. Not only do they do that sort of thing, but they also start looking at other avenues. What else might fall under this definition of divorce? I mean, Matthew 5 does say lust and adultery. It's the same thing. Look at that word. It says porn right there in the word. Seems pretty straightforward to me. And so they find what they were looking for all along, which is a way out, not a way forward, not a way to fix, not a way to repair and bring that marriage together, but a way to destroy it and have them without having to bear guilt. I don't say any of that to place a burden on people who have justly put away their spouses. I understand that. But we should not be hair-trigger about any of that. Well, finally, the objection is made that we live in a different world now. We live in a digital age, and because we live in a digital age, we need to recognize that adultery is taking on different forms, like so many other things in our world, in our life. They're taking on different forms, and that there are other ways to be together than just by being in each other's physical presence. This may sound like an odd connection, but when during COVID, lots of congregations didn't meet for a period of time, and so we did things online in order to try to maintain some sense of connectivity. A lot of people started saying things like, I mean, that's really an assembly, isn't it? You got a Zoom call, we're all there, we're all looking at each other's faces, and isn't it, I mean, essentially the same thing as being together? It's not. It's a poor substitute. Now, I'll take it over nothing, but it's not the same as being together. And you are not fulfilling your responsibilities to be together when you are virtually together. Because as Marshall said, virtually is not the same thing. It's not actual. It's not in real life. And so we want to make those distinctions. And so the people who were saying those sorts of things were giving credence to this right here. And in fact, I've heard people on this matter say, you know, when we met together, we said that was a worship service. Well, I didn't say that. And the people who did say that shouldn't have, because it's not. It's not the same thing. Well, we do want to apply the truth to any and every age that we live in. James chapter 3 talks about the sins of the tongue. It talks about the tongue in so many dangerous ways that we need to harness and so forth. And of course, I've used that to apply to social media. He doesn't say Facebook is the very world of iniquity and that it's a fire and that fire's from hell. But you could put it in there pretty easily, right? You see how it applies to social media, and you do see that words are what's being talked about, and it is an easy comparison and an easy application to make. But while we do want to bring these ancient truths into where we live in any age, we aren't changing the definition of sins. So what's not happening here is we're not saying, well, that used to be the definition of a bad usage of the tongue, but now it's something else. No, it's the same thing. We're carrying over the same sin, and we're saying, here's how that sin plays out in the digital age. The ancients were not without means of committing lust, which, while Jesus draws a comparison between lust and adultery, there's still the contrast. He says it's like this. He makes it a comparison to this. It's spiritually one and the same as, but because he's using two different words, he's showing they are two different things. They had the ability to commit lust back then. They had images. Marshall mentioned those. You can go see, you can see the actual images, unfortunately, but you can also just see descriptions of the things that they would show in Pompeii, but also in Asian countries, going back many, many centuries, millennia. And so they would use those in order to commit lust. But not only that, they also had women who would perform in order for men to commit lust. That's not a new invention. That's not something that we came up with in the 20th century. Now, in the 20th century, what we came up with is the ability to access that wherever you are. You didn't have to go to a particular part of town to access that. But you're accessing the same thing. And there's a difference between watching someone and participating with someone, engaging physically with someone, intercourse with someone. And so they had, even though they didn't have it on their phone, they had it right in front of them. They had all the same things happening that we're doing today, just instead of looking at a phone, they had to go somewhere in order to engage in those things. But it's not the same. It's not the same as being there in person. In 2 Samuel chapter 11. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, when evening came, it says, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. And so he inquired. I want to suggest to you, David's already guilty of lust. But he is not yet guilty of fornication and adultery, much less murder. There's so many things that are about to happen in this story. And they do all begin with lust. And it is why I would plead with anyone who is in the throes of lust to understand you have no idea how far that can take you. But what if David had walked away? What if he had committed the lust but overcame it at that point? What a different story we would be reading. It would change the whole trajectory of his entire reign, because he did not add the worse, the more abominable sin to the one he already committed. So we've got to make those distinctions. And we got to understand that even in the digital age, the definition of sin, the definition of lust is the looking and the thought process, and even engaging at an emotional level, and all those sorts of things are true and they're there, but you haven't gone to the next step, which is going in person and interacting in person with someone else. That then now becomes fornication. And digital age doesn't change that, right? That doesn't make any difference there. I'll just give you an illustration to take that one step further. Because people will say, look, this is what Wilson Adams says, look, this is the same emotional damage, it's the same, the woman feels the same, she feels betrayed in all the same ways, and all those things are there. I understand that. Let's say that instead of finding images on your husband's computer, what you instead find is a box of handwritten letters between him and a lover. And we'll say lover in the old-fashioned sense, that they pour their hearts out to each other. My wife doesn't understand, you get me, all of those things. But there's no actual physical interaction. This is a pen pal that he commits emotional adultery with. I think most people would still say, well, now that's not adultery. You're right. In the same way that this is not adultery. Now, would it be painful to find that shoebox? Horrible. Would it set the marriage into a terrible place where there's a lot of work to do, and if you want to repair and rebuild trust, you've got a long road to go? Yes, all of that's true. But divorce is not on the table. And I'll say this then, finally, about that. What we're saying is not that there's not work to do. Somebody asked me one time while I was speaking at Jim Deason's conference that Marshall referenced this morning, another different year. And in speaking about that, the subject of abuse came up. And somebody said, what should we do about abuse, about physical abuse in a marriage? And I said, I don't have all the answers right now. First of all, I think it's definitely a case-by-case basis. You have to figure out what's going on and so forth. But I said, what we should first do is go ahead and say out loud, divorce is not an option. We should know what the boundaries are. We should know where God has said you can go there and where you can't go. And so that's what we're doing here. We're not saying lots of things need to happen. If you've got a spouse who is wrapped up in adultery, work needs to be done. Come to the elders. Come to find some help, get some help. But I do understand, I'm going to start here. Divorce is not on the table. That's not an option. We're going to go ahead and draw that boundary. Now, let's work within that boundary to see what we can do and to see what next steps are best and are possible. If you're here this evening and you're not a Christian, I want to suggest to you that you might look at lessons like today and think, maybe there's somebody here thinking, this is why I'm not a Christian. All these rules and all these strictures and everything, and it's just, and you know, I don't understand how that's appealing at all. I'll tell you what's appealing about it. We live in a world where the rules are always changing with the whims of the most radical people in the world. But we have a book written by an all-knowing God with all wisdom that has never changed. That is a great comfort. Even if it is unpopular, it is a great comfort to know that this, we can go back to this and it'll still be the same, and it'll still be the same. No matter what technology comes along, no matter how culture changes, we'll say, this is what I still live by. Oh, that should be an appeal. And if that is appealing to you, if you want to live by the standard of the one true God, and we can help you in that this evening in obedience to him, if there's any way we can assist you, won't you come while we stand and while we sing.